that's a mobile conversation. Peter, what's your view on the sort of the interconnect question of what changes? Is it enterprise driving interconnect because of things like work from home and cloud use? Is it the content companies for consumers? Where does that go?
Well, I think it's sort of a virtuous cycle, right? I think it's the enterprises, driving the content providers to enable better, interconnectivity so everything works better, which is what the end user enterprise customer wants. And that in turn, causes the service provider to demand it from somebody like EdgeMicro. Like, hey, if you don't have the right interconnection in your small data center at the edge, your small data center at the edge isn't that useful to me. But I think it starts with the end user always, right? What's the value proposition of doing it? Greg, you were just talking about sort of an example in Denver, which made me think of something that was really interesting. Simultaneously, we were, back when I was at DH Capital, working with StackPath, as well as in the middle of trying to sell the Infomart building in Dallas, which Equinix ended up buying. And what was interesting is, at that point in time, StackPath was doing a lot of software updates for a very large hyperscaler. And there was sort of, a day a month where they would release their software updates, patches to, game consoles, whatever. And the amount of bandwidth that consumed was unbelievable. And what we saw at the Infomart building was all that traffic that was going to basically Houston and Dallas, ultimately probably through Comcast cable modems to the end users, would literally slam, completely max out the bandwidth between those cities and the Infomart building. And so therefore, if somebody was trying to stream a movie or something, that content was, immensely congested trying to get to the end user, because all those software updates, massive files, as we know, were all trying to get to the same place. So that was a great edge application to instead have those updates delivered from the edge off of StackPath infrastructure. And it relieved a tremendous burden on the carriers to deploy lots of extra capacity just to meet one day a week or one day a month. I think, it just makes the point that this interconnection, back to Martin's point about studying, just study the flow of the bits. If you really understand how the bits are traveling, you sort of understand what's driving all of this. And, if the data center, if the infrastructure is not interconnected well to where the bits are trying to go to get from and get to, it really minimizes the utility of it all.
Martin, what's your take on this? Peter, I think my take from what Peter and Greg was saying is that this is very heavily driven by content, perhaps above application, although maybe also things like software updates. Is that what you're seeing? It's still very content centric?
Content, it's both content and applications. It's both. It really is. And it is studying the flow of the traffic. We've seen a few examples for sure. We saw the one that Greg discussed. Shoot, if you're trying to just even do a Teams meeting with someone else in Denver, because of the interconnection, even both points are in Denver, that traffic may not exchange all the way to Dallas or San Francisco. And that's horrible, right? And so when you start looking at that use case or the dissemination of patches where that's just kind of pushing out to the edge, all of those cases, it's impossible to argue that it wouldn't be better if we just exchange traffic at the edge so traffic can travel shorter distance. I think everyone would agree. The question is, well, what is the hurdle to make everyone change? Because you do have to move away from just layer 2 backhaul or layer 1 backhaul to say, we're going to do routing things closer to the edge so that we can actually exchange traffic. Now, you ask, it's interesting because the one thing that I thought would be the last to change, I thought enterprises would be the last to just have massively what we call local internet access. The big enterprises have always been very hub and spoke, all right? And they've changed. They've gone internet all the way out to the edge, security all the way out to the edge, and so that they can get to the best possible path to the application or the service or the content. And now I think the intermediary infrastructure needs to change in order to serve that traffic locally. And it just has happened in the opposite sequence than I would have expected. SD-WAN has enabled.
I was going to say that's an SD-WAN. So it's almost like SD-WAN is driving it, and then the SD-WAN is now the middle part of that infrastructure needs to catch up.
It does, and oddly, you see little bits and pieces where the enterprise is almost funding some of that change. They might have a handful of, say, 20 sites in a region that have to go all the way back to Seattle to actually get to the application. And they're just saying, why don't we just put our own edge location in the region inside of a micro data center or wherever, and it solves our issue. But that's an opportunity where the service providers can reach out and solve.
That's really interesting. So Greg, are you seeing that sort of intersection between the edge world and the SD-WAN world?
Well, starting to, yes. And it's interestingly, it's all driven by money. So if the service providers believe that they can monetize this, then they're going to do it, and they're starting to look at that. So yes, I'm starting to see it.
Thank you. And I've got a good question here, which actually fits in some research that I've been doing as well. It says, do neutral host providers have an opportunity and maybe an advantage to leverage venue rights and relationships for edge use cases? Edge use cases like IoT and security cameras and maybe in-venue content delivery. For people who are listening who are not familiar with the term neutral host, there's a few different definitions, but I think here it's neutral host wireless providers who have a contract to provide, I feel like, a wholesale wireless infrastructure in a large venue or office or mall or something like that, where the carriers then use their neutral third-party sort of in-building wireless. And I'm seeing there's that possibility of neutral host wireless, edge computing, smart building technology. Any of you seeing that sort of convergence?
I'm not seeing it yet, but I agree with the thesis 100% that those things all go together very nicely.
I mean, I suppose, Greg, I mean, are you thinking about installing any of your nodes in building rather than on a sort of I suppose a more macro environment?
Certainly, we've been looking at a few venue use cases. It's very slow going. The stakeholders in that ecosystem to play together is just not. It's just not. It's starting to gel a little bit, but
it's sort of the dart points model, right, Greg? It's like the dart point.
Yeah, that's correct.
Sort of the in-building data center, or if you go back in time to the business, local exchange carrier that ran fiber in the risers and tried to be telephone and data, in the building. But those models prove very difficult. You've got to work with landlords, and anybody who's spent any time in the real estate world quickly figures out that mentality is very different than what most of us are used to. It's a very zero-sum game. There aren't partnerships. There's 10 nickels on the table. I want all 10. You're trying to take one from me. I don't want to give it to you. So, it's
in almost all those cases, based on what we've seen, you're probably better served by something just a little bit further upstream to serve a wider area, with the exception of maybe buildings that just have really poor upstream connectivity, or maybe arenas and sports type of locations where you have massive amounts of people that might be served best by something local.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we're going to see sort of the right, if like quantum of edges for a business park or for almost like the campus site, the campus scale, sort of thinking in terms of a 3-mile radius or something like that. It could be whether it's in Silicon Valley or whether it could be a new business district in a city center, or an out of town, it could be a port or an airport or something like that. I think that seems to me to be the right sort of scale for some of this.
You've seen some of that in the private space, like say, Quantico, right? That fits all those parameters and usage density. but yeah, you can get those economics there.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes before we wrap up. I mean, there's a few other questions which if there's any that have jumped out to any of you, pick those up. Otherwise, I'll probably ask people to come up with any last thoughts on what we've been talking about. There's certainly there's a couple of questions there on where does all this fit in with can data centers deal with the evolution of cloud versus edge, or fit with both technologies? I'm not quite sure what angle that's taking, but if you have thoughts on that. Others that people have noticed? Anything, Peter? I know you were having a look, answering a few of the questions there. Any that jumped out?
I mean, the only thing, I guess, Greg, not to keep prompting you to have to talk, but just speaking to this whole idea of like some of the things EdgeMicro is working on to sort of enable this, wireless interconnection world. Because it is, as Martin, I think, pretty eloquently said, gave the example of Denver, how do you, what are things that like, EdgeMicro is doing to try and enable that local offload to work well, where you can really tap the advantage of having that content so close to the people that want to consume it?
Yes, thanks, Peter. We call it Mobile Edge Traffic Exchange, or in acronym METX, and that is the software that actually breaks packets out between the radio and locally cached content or compute way upstream from what would be either the serving gateway or the evolved packet core, which for Verizon and AT&T exists in Dallas, which is the main drain. So the wireless networks are architected very differently, obviously, than terrestrial. They were designed for voice back in the 80s and 90s and not for data. And so they are trying to move those evolved packet cores out, and install them out at the edge, but it's just really difficult to get that scale and the infrastructure. These are not trivial retrofits. When you start to go into a central office and retrofit it, not to get into NEBS compliancy and all of that, but these are not simple engineering feats to do this, or construction feats. And that's where companies like ours, it's all about scale. This is not interesting to anybody at 10, 20, 30 sites. We have to get to 100 sites as quickly as possible and then scale from there. For this to be interesting to our stakeholders, which are, certainly the service providers, and then our customers, the hyperscalers and CDNs.
The interesting thing there, you mentioned EPCs. Firstly, that changes with 5G, and secondly, Microsoft just bought 2 EPC vendors, which I suspect is not unconnected. Okay. Any last comments, Peter or Martin or Greg? Because I think I'm going to have to wrap this up before I have the broad group guys shouting at me.
No, it's just, it's just a super dynamic area that's going to see a lot of very rapid evolution as these, I think we finally are seeing sort of critical mass come together in some of these use cases and business cases for investing capital really become real. And I think the pace of change is going to really be fast. It's going to lead to a lot of, M&A activity, a lot of investment activity. That's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think there's a lot of interesting use cases. I know we didn't talk about gaming a whole lot, but business will push on that. Security will push on that. But basically using the edge to almost find the best path, whether it's a local path or whether it's a long range path, very dynamically, which is an extra level of optimization for the internet, and edge will play a big role in that. Great.
All right. Well, thank you all very much, and thanks to all of the people asking questions. There's been a good flow of those. It's a shame that we're all doing this online rather than in Monaco, as this event would normally have been. But hopefully, the next time round we'll be able to do this with a proper view of the bay there. Once again, thank you all very much. Thank you to Peter, Greg, and Martin for this, and there's more in the Datacloud Global tomorrow as well, which you can sign up for.
Thank you, Dean. Very
Thanks,
much.
Dean. Thanks, Peter.
Cheers.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.